Noswaith a gyfeillion. Good evening, friends. It's a pleasure to be here at the Caryl Literature Festival. My name's Elin Jones, and I'm representing Wales Literature Exchange and Literature Across Frontiers, who have curated the Welsh presence as Wales guest nation at this festival. So it's a great honour for us to be here with Wales as guest nation for the first time at Caryl. Joining me in our discussion this afternoon or this evening are two of Wales's most prominent writers who write in the Welsh language. The Welsh language is completely different to the English language. It comes from a very different root. It, of course, has some English borrowings in its contemporary use today, as many other languages in the world, and also English itself borrows heavily too from lots of different linguistic contexts. Welsh also has, independently from English, a lot of Latin influence as well, but it is essentially a Celtic language with its own grammatical structure and its own specific linguistic phenomena. Welsh is spoken by around 500,000 people in our country. We have a population of 3 million, and in the children's population it's spoken by a larger percentage than the adult population. It has a very vibrant literary scene. Even with only 500,000 speakers, volumes of poetry and novels are sold in comparatively good figures compared with languages that have a much bigger market. Welsh language literature also has a great range of literature, and we will discover some of that range this afternoon with our two guests. Caryl Lewis, next to me here. They are, by the way, two Lewises. We may have an abundance of poetry and literature in Wales, but we don't have that much abundance of surnames. So very often people might think people with the same surname are actually married or related to each other in some other way, but I can assure you, as far as I know, there's no connection between these two. So Caryl Lewis is an award-winning Welsh language author who's published 11 books for adults, 3 novels for young adults, and 13 children's books. She came to prominence as an author with her novel Martha Jack a Sianco that was published in Welsh in 2004 and won the Wales Book of the Year award. It was published in English translation in 2007, and it is available here for sale. Her next 2 novels, well, her other 2 novels, Agemydd the Jeweller and Now Mis 9 Months, were shortlisted for the Wales Book of the Year award, and she won that for the 2nd time in 2016 with her 10th novel, A Bwthyn, and then for the 3rd time for her latest book, a collection of short stories called A Gwreiddyn, The Root, and we will hear an excerpt from that collection a little bit later on. Caryl also writes extensively for cinema and television, notably adapting her own novel, Martha Jack a Sianco, for film, and this will be shown here at the Caryl Literature Festival. This film won 8 BAFTA awards, and Caryl won an Atlantis Prize at the 2009 Moondance Festival in Colorado for Best Script. Her TV credits include the Welsh scripts for the internationally successful crime series Y Gwyll, Hinterland, where she was adapting work, and also she is a writer with Craith Hidden, another very successful TV drama. The series has been sold to international broadcasters in Denmark, Norway, Slovenia, Finland, other European countries, including Germany and Poland. And she'll be discussing her work from page to stage to screen with the Basque writer Arcaitz Cano on Saturday in this festival. Llyr Gwyn has studied at Cardiff and Oxford universities, completing a doctorate on the work of T. Gwyn Jones and W.B. Yeats. Following periods as a lecturer in Welsh at universities in Swansea and in Cardiff in Wales, he works now as a resource editor at the Welsh Joint Education Committee. He publishes poetry, fiction and articles in periodicals. His first prose work, Rhyw Flodau'r Rhyfel, Some Flowers of War, won the creative non-fiction category in the 2015 Wales Book of the Year Award, and we will hear an excerpt of that translated into English a little later. His poetry collection, Storm ar Wyneb Haul, Storm on the Face of the Sun, was shortlisted for the poetry category. His first short story collection, Fabula, published, was also shortlisted for the fiction category of the Wales Book of the Year in 2017. And also in 2017, Llyr was selected as one of the 10 new voices from Europe, part of an innovative project focusing on emerging writers and audience development for international programming at festivals, and this was coordinated by Literature Across Frontiers. As a poet, Llyr writes in strict meter poetry as well as in free verse. He competes with his team of fellow poets, the fugitives or the refugees possibly. They compete in the annual BBC Welsh Language Poetry League, Talwr na Beirdd, and in last year's league they ended up runners-up. So I'm very pleased to be able to host this discussion with these two writers, and our theme this afternoon is Tales of Independence and Belonging. The title of the session is derived from a collection of short stories that will be published later this year, which includes one of Llyr's stories, along with other European writers. So if we think of tales of independence and belonging, and tales, I suppose, is what you two do as writers, where do you see that you belong in terms of, do you belong to specific literary scenes? You write in the Welsh language. Do you belong in any way to those literary worlds that exist in that language? Is Wales, is contemporary Wales your world when you start writing your stories and your tales? And to what extent do you feel that you belong there as Welsh language writers? What are your senses of belonging in your various literary worlds? Llyr, can I start with you?
Yeah. I suppose I belong to all kinds of different worlds. In terms of my poetry, which I started to write earlier than the prose, I suppose, that can sometimes be some sort of almost perceived as a bit of a boys' club, and is one of the reasons why I suppose one very easily gets into poetry in Wales. It's a very lively scene in terms of live performances, oral performances, and so it's something that as a young writer I aspired to become part of that sort of world in a sense, and so you start sort of performing on the circuit, if you will, going to poetry slams and participating in the Talwr, and so there's a real sense of fraternity there. Thankfully things are changing. The Talwr team that you mentioned there, with 2 boys and 2 girls, so there's a bit more equality coming in. But that's a big part of my identity, is being able to, especially in terms of the poetry, one feels, there's a long tradition and history in Wales of the poet as having a social function, sort of, in a way, trying to express or reflect or mirror in some way society's feelings, desires. In medieval times there was a very strong relationship between the king, the prince, the local lord, and the poet, and the way that the poet would sort of try and interpret the king's role in society to the rest of society. But I think that sort of still exists. Very often in Wales and in Welsh, people will sort of tend to look to poets in times of, I don't know, uncertainty or turbulence, and to try and express their feelings, you know, and people will come to poetry evenings expecting that. And and in a sense, growing older, that can sometimes be a burden as well, especially within the strict meters that I write. So I write in free meter and in free verse, but also I write in Cynghanedd, which is, I should just explain, it's an old system of strict meter poetry, the rules of which haven't really changed since around the 15th century. And especially when you're writing in Cynghanedd, you do feel that sort of burden, which can almost become oppressive at times. So belonging to that world is key to my identity as a poet, but it also a large part of it is trying to emerge from it in a sense of trying to do something different or innovative within those boundaries. Things are quite different when I come to the prose writing, but maybe I'll stop there for now and allow Caryl to speak a bit. Or
Before you do that, could you tell us something about the themes that you address through your strict meter poetry? You say that the rules of the form are unchanged largely since the 15th century. And in earlier years, the poet was sponsored by the king or the prince or the lords and was essentially a spin doctor for them. But today, the poet is, you say, the voice of the country, of the people, of the nation. Could you tell us a little bit about the themes that you've addressed in those strict meter verses?
yeah, well, it's something I've sort of shied away from more recently. You do feel that sort of pressure, really, to Llyr Gwyn, Wales's national poet, at the moment has a poem from his crown-winning collection, and the title is "And What Do the Poets Make of This?" It's almost like the go-to sort of, okay, we want a reaction from the poets, and I tend to shy away from that, really. But I don't know, a lot of the poetry in this collection is love poetry, lyrical stuff. So in a way, Cynghanedd, its function for many centuries was a very public sort of form of address, whereas I try, especially here and some of my early stuff, to express a more sort of personal lyricism, really, through the same metrical requirements. But more recently in Cynghanedd, I've written a long poem about Tiger Bay, for example, which was in Cardiff, the capital city. There was a very multicultural area that existed through most of the 20th century. All kinds of people from all kinds of different nations came to live in that area of Cardiff, and then from the 60s onwards it was sort of kind of bulldozed, and that culture has been sort of whitewashed in a sense. And so that was a poem about that. So in a sense that was quite political. Another thing that I wrote recently was a long poem in strict meters dealing with social media and its effects on people and sort of political debates, and that was against the backdrop of my hometown, Caernarfon. And that's another big theme as well. I mean, I'm from Caernarfon, which is in the northwest of Wales, which is, I think, around 80% Welsh-speaking area, so a very high number of Welsh speakers. And all the time I grew up, speaking Welsh was completely natural to me, my family, in society, at school. And then moving to Cardiff, the capital city, where the you know, it's quite a different scenario, really, where you're looking at a much lower percentage of Welsh speakers. And so dealing with that dichotomy, really, living in Cardiff in a fairly, well, not in Indian terms, but in Welsh terms, a fairly large city, and that sort of disparity, that difference between where I live now and where I come from is another quite prominent theme in my poetry.
That leads us to a sense, to looking at the phenomenon of urbanization as well, and people moving from rural areas into urban areas and into the cities, a phenomenon that we know is happening worldwide, and it's happening also in Wales, as we're no different from anybody else in that sense. Caryl, your worlds, your physical worlds in your writing as a novelist, but also in much of the television and film work that you've done, they're very much rural worlds as well, and they're very much perhaps against the grain of the trend of urbanization, yet within those rural worlds we see everything that you would see in the biggest city in the world in terms of the relationships between people. And so where do you see yourself belonging in terms of your physical worlds, your material worlds, but also your imaginary and your fictional worlds?
Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. Well, one of my worlds, to begin with, to do with form, is the novel. It always has been, and it's my first love. And I find myself being drawn back to the novel all the time. But I mean, I think it's true that I do try and push back a bit against the urbanization. And I think there was a period in perhaps the early 90s where novelists were separated into urban novelists, and I think it still occurs when Owen Martell brought out his novel, and Llyr Gwyn, all kind of touted as urban novelists, and there seemed to be this split between both. So that was the kind of thought of the time where I brought out my first novel that's gained a few readers, which was Martha Jakashanko, and it is set in a rural area, and it is set. It portrays a family that is struggling to cope with the speed of change around them, and also incomers to the area, changing the culture around them, changing the language around them. So I think the traditional Welsh culture, in its precariousness and its beauty and its stubbornness and its wonder, is the paths I tend to tread. And I think as well, language-wise, I remember when I was young and starting to write, it was one of my aims to keep the local dialect, to make a record of it, because I think when you do write in a minority language, you feel a weight of pressure to keep and make a record, and I don't know if it's in the back of your head that this will be an historic document in times to come, but I think that you always have that weight on you. So definitely to portray that to that world and that kickback against urbanization. And I remember when I was in my early 20s, we were all pushed to move to the city, to the Cardiff, and I felt in some ways as if we were pushing towards a modern Wales, but we hadn't really dealt or hadn't canu mawr nad Llyr would do to mourn the passing of the old Wales. And of course, in pockets of rural Wales today, as Llyr was saying, there's still a high percentage of people speaking Welsh, and indeed I myself live on a farm in a rural area, and I live entirely, even the postman speaks Welsh, so I live almost entirely through the medium of Welsh, and my children have a Welsh medium education, and they're entirely fluent in Welsh, and English comes later. So I think yeah, that's my area.
And the collection of short stories that you've just published now, A Gwreiddyn, there's a link that runs through all of those short stories. They're all located in that kind of area, in a very rural world. They present relationships between people that are as complicated as could be found in any urban area as well. But they do, one of them in particular presents a changing Wales as well, a changing rural Wales, and that's the story that you've decided to read an excerpt of this evening. Would you care to read some of that, but also to perhaps to introduce a little bit more if you would like to? Is Carol's mic loud enough for you to hear her? Yeah?
Yes. Well, A Graven is a book of short stories, The Root in English. And I very much like to think about nature and about literary forms. And I wrote a short story collection. My first one was based on the idea of a feather. Because to me, the physical form of a feather is a reflection of the perfect short story. It's light, it has a strong backbone when you think about a feather. And when you think about the hairs on the side of the feather, they are all exactly aligned in the same way as words should be in a short story. And if any of those hairs is out of place, then you notice it straight away. And of course, with a feather, we used to write with quills, of course, with feathers, and they are used to tickle us, like a short story should do as well. And also they can make us uncomfortable. And I liked that image. So I had a look then, and I moved on to A Graven, and I took the tree. And what's interesting about a tree, very much like people, is that on the surface of the earth, we can see the tree, but what we don't see are the whole ecosystem of the root underneath. And sometimes those roots are exactly the same size as what we can see. And exactly like people, most of what's interesting about people, what anchors them, what makes them grow, we don't see. And this is what I was trying to look at in this book. So they're all quite domestic stories. They tend to be of very few characters. I like to make life difficult for myself for some reason. But we meet characters at very important times in their lives. But this story is slightly different. It's called The Current. It is a story about a young Polish man having moved into a very rural Welsh area. And he's moved over from Poland to work in a slaughterhouse where they slaughter animals for food. And this happens a lot in rural Wales. We have a lot of Polish immigrants come through and work. And that sense of two people meeting at a terrible time for one of them, and the effect that has on both of them. So he's walking to work at 5 o'clock in the morning, and he sees an old Welsh gentleman in his tweeds, and he's walking into the river after a lot of rainfall, and it seems that he's about to end his life. The Current, I'll just read a little bit. Piotr was on his way to work in the slaughterhouse when he saw the old man walk into the water. His shift started at 5, and he thought at first that the tweed jacket and the cap he could see through the river mist must belong to one of the fishermen he'd come across, tickling trout out of their element. Piotr held off a while, but when he realised he was up to his chest in water and that his cap had been captured by the current, he threw down the butt of his cigarette. The river was in full spate following non-stop rain, and the man was holding his own against the flow that threatened to topple him any minute. A heartbeat. Then Piotr watched as the white face and the dark clothes went under without a word. Kurwa, he swore. He ran along the path, shrugging off his rucksack. He knew that the pressure would hold him under, forcing him fast through white water. Pulling his sweater over his head, only stopping to hop out of his shoes, into the river he went. The cold was a body blow. He took a deep breath and upended himself. All night the rain had hammered the roof of his caravan behind the pub. Flat on his back and wide awake, the storm had kept him company. By this morning, with soil washed from its bank and its depth stirred to a frenzy, He could see nothing in the river. He was blind. Surfacing, he rubbed the wet from his eyes. "Old man!" The current beat against his body and took him also in its grasp. On its bank, and as it went towards the old bridge, the water folded and was enfolded in creamy clouds of foam. "Siadek! Old man!" There was no noise except the water's terrible roar. He had been stunned, but now he felt the cold. He couldn't resist the pressure as the river took his legs from under him. He felt the skin on his shoulder rip. He breathed bubbles as the air was gone. The sheer weight of water was on his chest, with no chance of a breather before being taken under all over again. Then he was spat out of the main channel. Under the bridge, he came up, took a deep breath and coughed. Son of a bitch. He groped for the limb of an old tree lying limp across the water. But then he saw a white hand in black waters. He fished for the hand and pulled the old man towards him, turning his face towards the light, supporting him under his chin. He kept hold of the branch with his other hand. "You're trying to kill me too, eh?" Taking him in his arms, he could feel the slightest movement in the old man's back. Piotr looked up at the old bridge's underside. Decades of damp had coated it in stones in black slime. If he let go, back they would both go, underwater. Nor could he drag himself out with one arm only. Waiting was the only game.
Thank you. Thank you, Caryl. Thank you. It's a very poignant story, I think, and I hope that that sense of storytelling was captured in the translation that was prepared for you by a very experienced translator who's also translated some of your other work as well. You have to let go of your own work when you put it forward for translation. How do you find that relationship between belonging, if you like, the translation belonging to you as a writer, or belonging to the person who translates for you, if you like?
I'm quite mindful when somebody translates my work to give them free rein, because as a writer I like to have that freedom myself, and they need to be able to take that work and to ingest it and then put it out there as their creation and to breathe new life into that work. And I think that just finding the right translator who has the same ear as you is half the battle, I think. It makes it much easier. And to have a translator that has the same tone to their work, and the same temperature as well. I think sometimes you can come a cropper when translators maybe have a cold tone and you have a warm tone, and it's all tonal, it's all musical, it's all, you know, to do with the year, I think. So, I mean, I like to give that freedom, and in the same way, when people are adapting your work for the screen, it's exactly the same way, and of course, extra things come in then, like money. You know, they won't set up a particular scene because it costs too much. So, you know, there's, or actors can't be had or whatever. So I think you have to have that freedom. But I think I'm quite comfortable with that, because when I write my novels and when I write my short stories, I have total control. So after that, I'm more than happy that other people would respond to it creatively.
Thank you, Llyr. We heard in Caryl's short story there a presentation of a representation of rural Ceredigion today, and a relationship between an old Welsh man and a younger Polish man living in the same village, sharing a geographical space. And the piece that you've decided to read today in the session is again about the relationship between a young Welshman, in your case, and people from other nationalities when during the war years, and the story that you yourself then graphed onto your uncle's, your great-uncle's experiences in the war, and his, again, a vision or an image of Wales and Welsh existence living side by side with other nationalities in the world. So would you like to say a little bit about the piece that you're going to read to us this evening as well?
Oh, there's loads I want to say now after listening to Caryl. But the first thing to say is that, in a sense, even though Caryl writes about a world that I could never write about, and I could never feel that I could write about it, there are so many, you were asking about themes earlier. There are common themes, because that sense of language, that awareness or perhaps fear of loss of language is something that hangs over you as a writer in Welsh all the time, even if you don't want it there, if you want to get rid of it, it's sort of still there. So if you're either sort of addressing it directly or not, it's still hanging there in a sense. And attached to that really is then that sense of memory, personal memory, cultural memory, national memory, how those things intertwine. And that's something that I address in the prose. And as well as that, I think that for some reason in my prose, I tend to have a more outward look than I do with the poetry. Perhaps because, again, with the poetry, I'm very aware of that instant audience, if you will, that audience that I perform to, and I perform in front of them. And so my concerns, in a sense, are much more local when I'm writing my poetry. When I turn to prose, I feel I have more freedom to look outward. But in a sense, that's what I do here in Llyr Gwyn, which has been wonderfully translated, I think, by Katie Gramich into English, into Traces of War, is to try and deal with, really, Wales's, as well as that relationship between my generation and the generation of the Second World War, also Wales and its place in the world, its ambiguous position, really, when it comes to empire, as sort of a participant in empire, a country that some might argue benefited perhaps from empire, but also a country that I'm sure many of us feel now still sort of feel the oppression of empire as well in many senses. And so this is a book about my great uncle who was killed in the Second World War in Syria, of all places, and sort of me coming to grips with that and learning about that and placing that against my experiences of travelling in Europe and in other places where, well, theatres of war in a sense, and seeing the shadow of war all across Europe and across the world. And this bit I'm going to read because I think this book was written before it was written in 2014, which of course is before that dreaded word that was going to come up at some point during the discussion, Brexit, and so I didn't even know that this wasn't really on my horizon at the time I was writing this book. But some of the themes that are in the book have sort of come back to haunt me after Brexit. The way that we still, in the UK and in Wales, just haven't dealt with the trauma of the Second World War, and you see that now very often in the narrative surrounding Brexit, this perverse desire really to hark back to some sort of Blitz spirit. And what I do in this book, in a sense, is recognise that in myself, because it's perverse and it's something that I really react quite strongly to, really, but it's there. It's that almost a perverse sort of envy of my grandfather's generation, because they had to endure the hardship in a sense and had to prove themselves. And in that sort of post-capitalist sort of ennui of the world that we live in, I can't help but admit that there's something there that appeals to someone, at the same time as admitting, if I was to be pitched into that period and to that generation, I just couldn't cope, I would crumble completely. So this is me now in London, researching in the National Archives in Kew, trying to get some sort of information about my great uncle and the way in which he died and where he's buried and that sort of thing, and it proved to be a fruitless day. So my researches in the archives that day proved comparatively fruitless, and in the tube station, waiting for a train to take me back to the centre, I decided for some reason not to get on the first train, which thundered out of the tunnel into the light of the platform, but rather to wait for the next, because, so I rationalised later, of some curiosity, which made me want to see what the underground platform would be like after the bustle of departure. The few travellers dashed for the carriages, the train doors closed, leaving me outside, and with a low humming, which gradually grew louder, the train left the station behind, drawing the wind into the tunnel after it, like someone breathing in. I watched the dust and dirt swirling about before settling down once more, and I listened to the few leaves near the stairs whirling, rustling, and then lying still. The footsteps of the one or two travellers who had got off the train echoed as they made their way to the exit, and there was one other person in a long coat standing at the other end of the platform. That person coughed, and my gaze caught his as both of us looked at the information board from time to time, watching the remaining time tick away before the next train thundered its way towards us. The rats down on the track started to scrut once more, and it felt as if the station, which had taken a breath and held it in as the train left, was now beginning to breathe again. I myself felt the same somehow or other, as I tried to trace and to track the Second World War through this city, while it persisted in slipping away from me whenever I caught hold of it. The war, in all its horror, had thundered through the world, and the world had held its breath. Now we, who were left behind on the platform, were able to start breathing again, and coughing, and listening to the dust settle. But at the same time, we knew that the travellers in those carriages were racing further and further away from us, and that they would soon be at the farthest reaches of the city, at the most distant edge, and that we needed to gather every particle of dust before they reached the ground again. When the next train arrived, I did not hesitate, but got on it at once and found a seat. So really, it's a sense about, in a sense, it's about, how do we, because it was written in 2014, a century after the First World War, and, it's all about sort of memory and how do we remember and commemorate. Is there a difference? Is there a similarity? And who gets to choose how we remember? Because in the middle of all that sort of jingoistic stuff that's going on back home at the moment, you feel that the commemoration of the First World War especially and of the Second World War is being claimed by people to very particular ends. And I wanted to try to resist that in a sense by telling my great-uncle's story.
And of course, during the 4 years of commemoration that's taken place in the UK between 2014 and 2018, we've had what you referred to as Brexit. Of course, we had the referendum on the UK's membership of the European Union, right in the middle of that in 2016. And Wales, as a majority, as slim a majority as the UK in general, is painted as voted to leave the UK. But leave the UK? Leave the EU!
I wish.
But the areas where the three of us live and come from, in your cases indeed, didn't vote in that way. And the Welsh-speaking areas, many of them voted to remain, as did the capital city. So, how do you see that particular vote, that demographic? How do you see any relevance between the way in which people voted and the way in which people perhaps identify themselves? Do you see any resonance there?
I think it is important to note that areas where there are high percentage of Welsh speakers with a knowledge of a different culture and a minority culture voted to stay in. And I think that is quite significant because it shows that in those places people are, can identify with other cultures more, that they look perhaps, instead of looking towards London, particularly in publishing, that we're starting to look beyond London and we're looking to Europe more. So I think that it is significant that happened. I mean, Llyr was talking earlier about his shock, I think, the day after the referendum results, and I think that resonates with everyone, the disbelief perhaps the next morning. It is indicative of the mindset in Wales at the moment, but I'm glad that people like Llyr do confront these issues in his work politely, but also quite persuasively and strongly as well. But I do think it is significant that we have a general understanding of what it means to communicate and to work with other cultures that perhaps is not present over the border, perhaps.
But the Brexit vote is a divided vote, isn't it? It's not, you know, it's 52, 48, whatever we look at, the overall picture. It shows a division in society. And as Caryl was saying, in some areas, in some Welsh-speaking areas, the vote went towards Remain. But in other Welsh-speaking areas, perhaps where there's less of a reading tradition, possibly, you know, a less of a connection with literature, possibly, the vote went towards Leave. So it's a divided society that we see through the lens of Brexit. How do you respond to that kind of division in society?
I wish I knew, because, you know, I would be a much better writer if I could, really. And I think it is, you know, important to acknowledge it, even though it was significant in terms of, you know, those Welsh-speaking areas. That was, those are the sorts of things one really wants to cling to. But, you know, I have to speak up for Cardiff here, which is, you know, a multilingual, multicultural city that also voted to remain in the European Union. And I don't know. We've only got like 2 minutes left. How do you do this? I think there are deep-rooted types, various types of poverty in Wales, economically and culturally. Yes, I agree with that, and I think that they are at the heart of why Wales voted as it did. And regardless of what happens now, those are things that are going to have to be dealt with and not going to go away. And it's difficult because sometimes you get so angry and quite smug also, but we really have to try and understand why people voted as they did, I think. I don't really feel qualified to pontificate on it, really, but it is something that I want to write about, even if it is obliquely. I mean, I wrote about the war and Wales's place in empire quite obliquely, quite tangentially, really, in Traces of War. And then in Fabula, the later book, one story there in particular was about Brexit, even though I don't think many people picked up on that, because it was about really the Protestant Reformation, which you might maybe call the first Brexit. You know, the original Brexit was Henry VIII saying bugger off to Rome, I don't know, but you know, there are parallels, and these things are cyclical. These things have happened before for different reasons, and we have to try and resolve them as in different ways, I think, than they were the first time round. I don't know if I'm making any sense anymore, really.
And access to diversity in terms of culture, in addition to economic factors, access to education and so on, but having more access to diversity in media, more access to diversity in culture and literature, perhaps could have shaped a different result, not just in Wales, but further afield in the UK in general. And perhaps one of the problems of Brexit, not just of the vote leading to Brexit, but the whole political project, is that it is a project about reducing diversity rather than enhancing diversity. It's about limiting voices rather than an abundance of voices, and it's about limiting the number of identities that each of us can carry as individuals and as communities, as we're sort of forced to merge within a single state, single nation, single identity possibly. Beep, beep, beep. The time has come for us to be quiet for at least a few minutes, because we have now an opportunity to have some questions and answers session with you, the audience. So we're very happy to take questions about all kinds of subjects, about strict metaverse, about feathers and the forms of short story, about Brexit, about translation, about diverse literary and creative worlds, and even about independence and belonging. We're happy to take any questions or comments.
Caryl, it is wonderful to know that you are dealing with the most often writers are most often going to the canopy ecology of the trees, but you are digging to the subterranean ecosystem of roots. So it is a rarity to know that you are after the root system, the subterranean roots. It is a wonderful idea to hear, because very often we are at the periphery, but you are digging deep. My question regarding Brexit, is Brexit a triggered by any about the linguistic divisions or by the media created event, Brexit? A social media created event or a linguistic division triggered event, Brexit? What is your take on it?
Well, I think the problem with Brexit, like Llyr was saying, that we have various types of poverty, and cultural poverty is one of those. And I think Brexit occurred because people didn't look at the roots of things. They took things for granted, and particularly a particular political class in the UK, they were perhaps more shocked than people living in the smaller towns away from London, away from the bigger centres in the UK. So I think, I mean, linguistically, as I was saying earlier, I think it is significant that a lot of people who are speaking Welsh and have another language have an empathy for other cultures and other languages, and I feel that's why it is important that we keep writing. It is a political act to keep writing in Welsh. And I think what frustrates people often is when one writes in Welsh is that people ask you, so when are you going to write in English? And it is such a frustrating thing, because it is we have a particularly taut relationship with the English language, I think, because we use it as a bridge for events such as these, and for translations in particular. If we want to go to an Indian language or French, we have to go via usually English. So we have a particularly taut relationship with the language that is, it is particularly fragile relationship, I would think. But I think if we all looked at the roots of things more closely, then there'd be fewer problems, I would think. Thank you.
Can I just add something quick? Yeah, again, I'm not entirely sure I'm going with this, but it's something, you know, we've all been grappling with this, really, haven't we, since the vote, trying to understand why these things happen, to get to the roots of things, in a sense. And you think about somewhere like the Monmouthshire voted to remain, but most of the South Wales valleys voted to leave. And you can't get much more Welsh than the South Wales valleys. You know, there are all types of different kinds of Welshnesses as well, and not all of them are, well, not by, you know, a great many of them are expressed through the medium of English, and I think that's something that we have to remember as well. So, well, I just wanted to make that point really, that it's not necessarily all to do with that linguistic divide. There are the cultural divides as well.
Do you think that our European identity as Welsh people hadn't gone down to the root, hadn't reached the root of our identities, hadn't in general, hadn't reached that inner sense of identity, that inner sense of belonging at that period when the vote took place? I'm saying this because I've worked with European projects for 30 years, and I would always try to make the point, if I was in this kind of situation on the peripheries of Wales, you know, in the smallest village anywhere in Wales, I would say here in Europe, and I would refer to Europe as being where I was, not somewhere else. But I was still doing that even up to the referendum. And my own particular take on it is that we needed another generation of young people in order to have the opportunities to travel, to have contact with other Europeans coming to live in our towns and villages, more time to develop personal relationships, social relationships and so on. We needed more time to mix with each other as people with other people in other parts of Europe. And we were a generation too late, really, when the vote came and hit us, because that depth of feeling of belonging to each other and of European identity, as well as Welsh identity or British identity or sexuality or gender identities or religious identities that we'd want to carry as well, but that that rootedness hadn't actually taken place.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I mean, it's very easy for me, as someone who's spent most of his, you know, childhood summer holidays caravanning in France or Italy, and then been raised, you know, digested Saunders Lewis, to think of himself as a European. And I'm fully aware that a great many people in Wales who haven't had the opportunities I've had, and so I can't blame them really for not having any sort of sense of European identity to their, you know, those layers of identity. You can't really blame them for that, because again it comes back to lack of opportunity, to poverty. Just the opportunities aren't there, and just how strong, how dominant English, aka British identity is as well, through the media that we imbibe, through television, through papers, through the radio, through the internet. You can't blame people really for feeling more British than they do anything else, I don't think.
I mean, I agree with Llyr. I think there's a very strong sense that Europe is over there. And I think because we have a lot to deal with our nearest neighbours, it seemed perhaps, as you say, a generation, a step too far. One step. It was that one generation almost that caught us out. So I mean, I agree entirely that people didn't feel that